Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome, friends of On the Way Home podcast. I am Michael Braithwaite. I'm the CEO of Blue Door, organization that works in the north, part of the GTA in York, Peel, and Durham, helping folks with affordable housing, with access to healthcare, and access to meaningful and well-paying employment. If you want to check us out, go to bluedoor.ca. Listen, the whole point of doing this podcast is to talk about the challenges we face in the housing and homelessness sector, and not just talk about them, but talk about solutions. So often we'll have guests on saying this is what we've done. A large part of those solutions are really the data and reports and the hard work and research in the background that helps us prove that things need to be done. Today is no exception to that. We have Ricardo and Liam, and they're talking about two different reports. We have a national report on what is called wage rents, or rental wages, and then we have Liam from New Brunswick, where they took that data from the national report that Ricardo and David McDonald did, and broke it down a little further in New Brunswick to talk about that. So we talk about how the report came around. They've been doing this report for a while, and how you've got a minimum wage and rent, which is, if you get a market at 30% being affordable, and the gap that continues to grow between rent and minimum wage, and how many hours you'd have to work to actually do that, and that continues to grow as well. We talk about this year's numbers, the growth. We talk about what's happening in New Brunswick, which used to be a relatively affordable place to live, and no longer is that the case. We talk about what does that mean for the broader discussion when rents go up, and Ricardo talks a lot about when rents go up, all these different things happen, right? For the broader kind of economic argument for productivity across the nation, etc. We talk about how that's happened in New Brunswick too. We talk about a recent election that's happened in New Brunswick, and a large part of the platform of the party that got in was built around affordability and housing and maybe capping. And Ricardo talks about how what needs to change is we need some stricter rental guidelines and controls around Canada, right? And that when those are in place, we see that people are able to survive, the economy thrives, that kind of thing. He talks about it. The pushback is usually from the real estate end of things that says there won't be any supply, if rental controls don't build, and that will actually hurt the economy. And he kind of debunks that through the conversations that we have. It's a fascinating conversation about some important research around the rental wage across Canada. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Let's go to that conversation. Welcome to the On the Way Home podcast. So happy to have you here.
Here. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, you're a return guest, 5-Timers Club yet, where you get your special robe, but you're working towards it, and you're doing great work, so you're always welcome back. So you know what? We're going to shake it up a little bit because you've been here before, Ricardo. I'm going to give Liam the first crack at this. Liam, we ask every guest that comes on the podcast the same question, and that is, what does home mean to you?
Yeah, so this is my first time on the podcast. I should probably introduce myself and some context as to where I'm from. So the Human Development Council is located in St. John, New Brunswick, and this is where I've grown up. So I'm from the St. John, New Brunswick area. Been here most of my life, and I think I feel very connected to this area because of the community and family I have here. St. John's not a huge city, but it's also not small. So it has this awesome quality of being big enough that you get to meet all kinds of people, new people that you've never met from all kinds of different backgrounds, but you still see people by name all the time, regularly, just out and about. And when you meet a new person, you'll always find usually one connection of somebody and somebody they also know. So it's a pretty cool place. And I went to school in the US, but I've been back here for a while, and I've been able to integrate and meet people in a way that I've never met them before. So yeah, my sense of home, I think, comes mostly from things like the 3Fs: faith, family, and friends. I also have the privilege of saying that and having a stable, safe roof over my head, which is an important thing. And yeah, so I'm really fortunate to be in the area that I am, and the people that I'm surrounded with.
I like that. I love the simplicity of that. Ricardo, I wonder if your answers changed. Since the last time we've had you on, what does home mean to you?
Well, I was born and raised in São Paulo, Brazil, so that's my hometown. I came to Canada because Trent University offered me a very generous scholarship to study international development and eventually social policy. So Peterborough is my Canadian hometown. And then now for 5 years, we have lived in Ottawa. I mean, myself and my family, my spouse is Quebecoise. So it's really important for us to be in a place where we can connect with the Franco-Ontarian community, to be close to Quebec, where we have family. But also, to Liam's point, ultimately, I move around quite a bit, but ultimately, family, friends, a community, it's where you will call home. And to his point too, like it's a privilege to have a stable, housing situation where you can invest in building community, or you can invest in creating those connections with friends and creating a network that is both just enjoyable socially, but it's also a safety net that you can count on, and should you ever need to.
I love that you guys bring up a lot of words that have been used over and over in answers to that question around safety, family, community. We have learned, I say, in the housing sector sometimes the hard way, that it's not just about four walls and a roof that makes a home. It really is family. It is really about community. Often we create community at emergency shelters and then put people in housing that lacks that community and wonder why it doesn't work, right? So community plays such a large part. Liam, you told us a little bit about your journey, and we're going to come back to you because I want to see how you got into this kind of work. Ricardo, we'll start with you. How did you get in? You talked about coming here on a scholarship. Why this type of work? Like, tell us a little bit about your journey.
My academic work, because I went to Trent for my undergraduate, but then I continued to my graduate studies. And my academic work originally was focused on Brazil and understanding the 1980s, 1990s social and economic context, the role of social movements who were extremely impactful and who brought about changes that very directly impacted me as a low-income kid, relying quite a bit in public activities and public services and extracurricular activities that are offered, in public spaces and for free. So I spent a lot of, my academic work focused on that and learning about that. But then, at a personal level, while I was doing that, Canada started becoming my home, my new home, right? And then I met my spouse, and then had kids. And so when that happens, my focus also changed to look at social policy in Canada. Sort of the same stuff that I was, trying to understand how it went down with my first home. Now, this new place that is now my home, and trying to make sense of it, and not just make sense of it in an academic way, but as Mark said, you don't want to just understand it. We want to change it. So it is kind of very deliberate attempt to understand what's going on in order to support movements that can bring about change, that make housing security more universal, that make food insecurity more rare, and so on and so forth.
Very cool. Thanks for that. Liam, tell us a little bit about your journey into what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I'm a recent grad from my undergraduate degree. I've been out of school for about a year and a half now. I went to school in upstate New York for a data science degree, and I had applied to some positions in the US, and I did some internships related to health research and some different things. And I was interested in that for a while, but I kind of felt the inclination towards doing some analytics that would have um, kind of a social purpose associated to them. I think from family influences, specifically growing up, kind of they instilled that in me. And so I eventually made the decision, okay, I'm going to come back to the St. John area. And so I decided in true St. John fashion to just start calling people, having 20-minute Zoom calls, just seeing who I could meet, finding meeting this person who refers me to this person who refers me to this person. And I ended up meeting a professor who knows the guy that I work under now, and just sent my resume to him without me knowing. And then I got an email in my inbox from Randy Hatfield saying, "Do you want to chat?" And then we had some video calls together, and he bought me lunch, and I met the team, and it was the right fit, I think. So that's how I ended up here, and I'm grateful for it.
All through food, man. That's a fantastic story. Thanks for sharing that. You guys both do great work and important work. And today we want to talk about that. We want to talk about the national report. And I think, Ricardo, you're going to address that. And of course, report out of New Brunswick, which Liam will talk about. Let's talk about the reports that you've done. How did they come about? And what was their purpose? Ricardo, we'll start with you.
Our report is called the Rental Wage Report, and is the third edition of this report. This concept was originally developed in the US, and we borrowed it and we adapted to Canada. Essentially, the notion of a rental wage is how much do you need to earn in order to be able to afford a 1 or 2 bedroom unit, whatever a family needs, without spending more than 30% of your total income on rent. We often talk about the 30% rule. Is a somewhat arbitrary rule, but that's another conversation. But is what we consider housing affordability. So someone who spends more than 30% of their income on housing, it's said to be living in unaffordable housing. So we want folks to be spending less than that, maximum 30%. But in order to do that, given what rents are right now, how much do folks need to earn? And so that's the rental wage. We calculate rental wage for different provinces, for different cities, and all the way to the neighborhood level. We look at almost 700 neighborhoods across the country. Then once you have that figure for the 1 bedroom, for the 2 bedroom, you can compare it. You can compare with, various income measures. We can compare with the minimum wage. We can compare to social assistance rates. We can compare to median income for tenants. You can do whatever analysis you find most relevant. For the national reports, we like to compare with the minimum wage in the various provinces. So that's what we did in 2018. We did it last year, and we did this year again. And what we've been finding is that there is not only a large, but a growing gap between minimum wages and rental wages. In most places across the country, someone who earns the minimum wage, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, cannot stay with or below the 30% threshold. Mostly, like in almost nowhere in the country, with very few exceptions. And as I said, we also see the gap growing. So we compare how minimum wages and rental wages have been increasing over the past 5 years, and the rental wage is growing. It's outpacing minimum wage increases, which it's our way of bringing together the two sides of the equation: the income side and the rent side, and bring the conversation about rent less so just talking about the household level and the individual hardship that households are experiencing, not in any way to belittle how important that is, but to broaden the conversation and talk a little bit about the economy, the labor market, and what does it mean to see wages and rents to be decoupled, to be, that far apart.
Right, Glenn. I don't think that's surprising to anyone, but the fact that it's growing is very concerning, of course, and we're going to dive more into that. Liam, you want to talk about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so the Human Development Council is we would be what's called the Social Planning Council for the province of New Brunswick. So one of the things we like to do quite often is take research that's done at the national level and try to tailor it and make it relevant for New Brunswick. We have a lot of things that are New Brunswick specific that are important to keep in context when we do our research, like the divide between North and South, being a bilingual province, urban, rural, suburban, some of the patterns we tend to see here. So what we did is took the report done by the CCPA at the national level and made a version of it for New Brunswick with a deeper dive into New Brunswick data as much as we could make available, and try to tailor the messaging to kind of what's going on in our context.
Very cool. Very cool. So let's talk about these reports, what you found out. First of all, nationally, you're saying is growing. Can you shed some light on how much have rental wages increased? And Liam, then I'll have you talk about that from the information from the work you've done in New Brunswick.
So just a couple of figures, so folks can kind of wrap their heads around with what all of this means concretely. So when we look at British Columbia, in October 2023, which when we were looking at this data, the minimum wage was $16.75, right? In order to afford a one-bedroom, a person would need to be earning around $30 instead. In order to afford a two-bedroom, let's say you're a single parent, for example, or you're a true adult household with a child, but there's only one income earner in the family for whatever reasons, you need to earn instead $36. So $16.50 is the minimum wage, $30 is what you need for one bedroom, 36 is what you need for a two-bedroom. If you look at Ontario, it's similar, 16.55, 28.5, 32.60, right? And you look at New Brunswick, the minimum wage was a little bit lower, 14.75 at the time. The one-bedroom rental wage was close to $18. The two-bedroom rental wage was close to $22.50. Right, so that's the gap we're talking about. And again, we do the deep dive within cities, we do the deep dive in neighborhoods, and we see pretty much the same thing. We looked at a total of 62 major urban centers, and in only 9 of them could a minimum wage earner afford a one-bedroom, and only in 3 of them could they afford a two-bedroom. The cities that remain more affordable to low and minimum wage earners, they're usually concentrated in Quebec and smaller cities in Quebec, not the major cities, not Gatineau, not Montreal, not Sherbrooke, not Quebec. They're smaller places. Sherbrooke used to be in the listing, but it's shifting. And so what we see over time, looking at the Quebec, but other places, is there are fewer and fewer cities that are still affordable, and the cities that are affordable, when we compare, how far away they are from that, scary threshold, we see that they're getting closer and closer, unfortunately. So the trend seems to be towards, fewer and fewer cities being affordable. And to my earlier point about, the trend over time compared to the minimum wage, one of our tables in the report, table number 2, compares, from October 2022 to October 2023, how much did the minimum wage increase by versus how much did the rental wage increase by, right? So we give us a notion of is this getting better? Is it getting worse? Or is it kind of neutral? Where are things? How are those two things moving? And then what we learned, unfortunately, is that in 8 provinces, rental wage increased more than the minimum wage. And this is unfortunate because we see provinces here that had pretty decent minimum wage increases in that period, but just rent increases were even higher. So what does that mean in practice is that in provinces where, noticeable minimum wages take place, and we would be generalized assumption that means that the material conditions of minimum wage workers is going to get a little bit better. But unfortunately, it's not the case, because a big chunk, if not all of that additional income is going towards to pay rent. There are 2 provinces where that was not the case. It's Manitoba and it's PEI. And I do not think it's a coincidence that these are the 2 provinces that have the best rent controls in the country. And also, the third place where it kind of like is kind of like a wash because the difference is very small is Quebec. Again, the third place with the best rent control policies in the country. So that's the kind of analysis we did, and we put a lot of emphasis on the question of rent controls, and we can talk about this later as a response, because I think it's safe to say that when governments increasing the minimum wage, when employers increase the wages of low-wage workers, there's a generalized assumption that this will have a positive impact on the material conditions of the workers, of the residents of the province, and not that will simply be a way to transfer yet more income to landlords.
It's so much to unpack there. It's amazing information. Liam, talk to me a little bit about what you've uncovered in New Brunswick.
Yeah, so I think to start, I'll just give a little bit of historical context into New Brunswick that listeners might not know. So New Brunswick for years has kind of had this reputation, whether it's entirely true or not, that we excel in affordable housing. While we had that reputation, things weren't perfect by any stretch. There was still core housing need, and definitely a problem with substandard housing condition. Part of the reason potentially for low rents, but comparatively, our housing was affordable and stable in its affordability. Just looking at increases in rent according to the Consumer Price Index for 2 decades, from 2020 to 2019, we actually didn't have an annual average increase in rent of more than 1.3% in New Brunswick, consistently beating national averages on rent increases year over year for roughly 2 decades. What we've seen, though, in the last 4 or 5 years is a complete reversal of that trend. Rental wages since 2018 have increased 41% and 46% for one-bedroom and two-bedroom apartments. Since October 2020, we've seen a 36% increase in rent. So that's 20 years of stable and low rent increases reversed in just a matter of 4 or 5 years. And this is, fueling what people are calling our housing crisis here in New Brunswick. Another thing we did in the report was compare 2018 to 2023. We calculated how many hours would a minimum wage worker have to work per week to meet that 30% threshold. So 40 hours is the benchmark, right? Like, we don't want to expect somebody to work more than 40 hours per week to be able to afford rent in their community. And in New Brunswick, we had 2 large increases in the minimum wage in the last 5 years. Within a 2-year span, I think the minimum wage went up 8.5% and then 15.7% again after that. So these are large, well above inflation increases. Even still, we saw that the number of hours minimum wage workers have to work per week has increased, even still. So up 3.5 hours per week to almost 50 hours per week of work for a minimum wage worker to afford one-bedroom apartment, and up 6.2 hours to 61 for a 2-bedroom apartment. So that's just some of the context into how rental wages have been increasing in New Brunswick.
Wow, and thanks for that. And and it just shows how you can be on the right path and things can change real quick. Liam, let's stick with you a little bit. Talk to me about in New Brunswick, how are rental increases? Is there legislation around it? How does it work? What about minimum wage? How does that work? How's that changed?
Yeah, so in New Brunswick, we actually do have some legislation regarding rent controls. There's some little rules around one increase per year. It must be you must give 6 months notice. It must be in a separate document. I'll just read a quote here that's from our provincial government describing what or how landlords can increase rent. It goes like this: for rent increases, a margin of no more than 1.5% is added to the Consumer Price Index when the Consumer Price Index is lower than 5%, to provide a chance for landlords to slowly catch up to market rent. When the Consumer Price Index is higher than 5%, the tenants benefit by having a threshold limit that is lower than the Consumer Price Index for added protection in the event of spike in inflation. So there's a complex formula that says at the Consumer Price Index for this year, landlords can increase the rent by an additional 1.5%, and then it slowly tapers off to 5 to 5%. But what we've seen is that rarely ever, only 1 year in the past like 25 years have we had some price index above 5%. So what that means is that as the legislation currently stands, our rents are allowed to increase at a rate higher than the consumer price index. And our minimum wage is indexed to the consumer price index. So what that means is that minimum wages increase this much, rents are allowed to increase this much every single year. And that's actually written into our legislation. Another thing that's kind of interesting in a New Brunswick context is landlords are allowed to actually increase rents above the threshold that's posted. They just have to apply, and it is often approved. And then there's a phase-in period that's often implemented for these rent increases. If a landlord or if rent is increased above what is permissible, it's on the tenant to file a complaint, and the review process has begun. And it's also on the tenant to file a complaint for a whole bunch of things: termination of lease agreements, false rent evictions, and a whole bunch of things. So so there's definitely a disconnect in New Brunswick between, like Ricardo has said, is occurring nationally, which is the decoupling of the affordability of a basic need like rent and the wages that are set out for low wage workers, such as the minimum wage, and how these things are trending in
the wrong direction.
Not the same direction. Yeah, exactly.
Not in the same direction, right? So let's talk about, guys, what does the growing gap between rents and wages mean for the housing economic debates more broadly? And you kind of touched on this, Ricardo, earlier.
When we talk about skyrocketing rents, we immediately think about the financial security, the housing security of low and moderate income households. And we spend a lot of time talking about this. And I think that's, important and a deserving focus of the conversation. But if you take a step back, there is a broader economic conversation, right? So I'm a political economist by training, and I spend a lot of time in the classic political economics debates, but also some of the more recent work that's happening, not so much in Canada, but a lot of good research on housing and political economy happening in the UK, especially a lot of good kind of more critical work coming out of that. And one thing that I find interesting in those debates is that it was acknowledged that there would always be a tension between employers and landlords, right? Because landlords put pressures on wages, and so they have conflicting interests. Employers want housing to be cheap, so they don't need to be increasing the wages all the time. And so that you go back to the classics, and there's this it's sort of very like in-depth detail debates about this. And the interesting thing is that in classic economics, if you think about like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and all of those folks back then, there was this acknowledgement that you have to price land and price property really high to prevent people from making easy money out of land, easy money of just owning property, which would have a detrimental impact in the broader economy, because people will not be investing in economic activity that actually generates growth and employment and revenue. People would be instead just sucking wages out of the economy, right? And it's interesting because you can go back there and you can pick your solution to the problem if you read liberal thinkers, or if you read the socialists, or if you read the anarchists. But the diagnosis of the problem was pretty much unanimous, that we cannot let the rentier class essentially screw everyone else in the economy more broadly, because we need people, to be active in the real economy. We lost sense of that debate right now. We lost, in Canada, we're not talking about the fact that high rents have a really negative impact on Main Street, because if you're paying too much in rent, you're sacrificing things. And that's where we kind of our minds usually go to, those sacrifices at the individual level. But sacrificing things means not consuming certain things. If you're not consuming certain things, someone's not selling them. And if that's their business, depends on those consumers, then. So I think that's the broad economic debate that David MacDonald, my co-author, and I would like to sort of help to fuel with this debate, right? When there is a very large share of the population, both on the rent side and on the home ownership side, is spending too much money on housing costs, we're not spending money on other things that are more productive from like a kind of a literal economic sense, more productive, and that actually generate economic activity. So now we start hearing debates about Canada's low productivity rates compared to other countries. We absolutely must connect the dot and saying, in a country where it is so easy to speculate with real estate, where real estate investment, which doesn't generate economic activity at all, provides such good returns on investment. Of course, there are these incentives to invest and to participate in the economy in other ways, right? So I think that's a kind of big debate. Just kind of like one caveat, so I'm not misinterpreted. I think the building part of housing is actual economic activity, right? That when you kind of the construction companies that come and build stuff and they hire lots of people and they pay taxes and they buy inputs and they that is an actual economic activity. The problem is all the speculation that happens before and after, right? And that's where we have to talk a little bit more about the role of government in coming and not necessarily building things themselves in the sense of like hiring carpenters and other trades. You can hire private companies to build, but it's the speculating that happens with the land beforehand, and is the profiteering that happens with renting units after. And those are the two places where if we had more direct public intervention and less room for speculation, that would very concretely have a positive impact on prices.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just doing some research a while back, just talking about like these large REITs buying up properties and the rents going up substantially because it's all about delivering the end of the day to your shareholders more and more, right? And they're able to do that through all the different loopholes and some of the stuff Liam's talked about, where where there's a will, there's a way. If you can go beyond, you're going to push the limits, and sometimes that is allowed, absolutely. But it's so very cool to talk about, like, hey, when rents go up, it's not just about housing. All these different things happen too, and we've seen that with food bank usage being at an all-time high, right? And it's great. I often quote Neil Hetherington from Daily Bread saying, "Look, we don't need more food. Food's a band-aid. If people are able to afford the housing that they need, we wouldn't need food banks, right? To be able to buy the food if they're paying that 30% that you talk about, for sure." Liam, what are you seeing? I mean, this is fairly new to New Brunswick, where these rents have gotten out of control. You said for a long time it was the kind of the place to be, or talked about affordability, New Brunswick. That is not the case now. So what are some of the repercussions from that?
I think there's likely many repercussions. I think Ricardo's comment is interesting and very relevant for New Brunswick. This idea that high rents having detrimental effects on the rest of the economy, how it's not a good investment for flourishing of the economy overall. Affordability is a top of mind conversation in New Brunswick in general. We just had a provincial election here and a change of government, and but the two number one points of contention seem to be healthcare and affordability. Affordability, not just around housing, but in general. Food, energy, rent. The opposition party that has taken power in government now has promised changes to rent control legislation, and so we'll have to see how that pans out. But yeah, I think another of Ricardo's comments that is relevant to New Brunswick is the difference between the building of new units and increases in rents. Another phenomenon we're seeing in New Brunswick is vacancy rates lower than we've ever seen them. There's some cities and communities in New Brunswick that literally CMHC has posted have a 0% vacancy rate, 0 to 1%, which is just clearly not sustainable for our communities in general. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. Those would be some of the comments around the conversation of New Brunswick.
Yeah, there's no the vacancy not being there, and it's crazy times, guys. Because you look at, I'll look at Toronto for example. Construction has ground to a halt, right? So we're saying we need hundreds of thousands. We don't have the buildings we need because we don't have the people to build them. We're putting people through different programs. We run one of them to build them, and there's no work because, and they'll state that the cost of borrowing money is now too high. So they're waiting to see if interest rates come down before they build more housing, putting us more behind, and that vacancy and that supply continues to dwindle, right? We need, I think Canada needs 5 million plus homes by 2030. Chances are we are not going to hit that goal, but we need a lot more supply. We need a lot more affordable supply. So it kind of beckons the question, what has to change moving forward for that gap that you both talked about between minimum wage and rents to shrink, and so what are your hopes? Like, what has to change? Ricardo, we'll start with you.
So mid-1960s, we have high inflation, and mid-1970s, we have inflation is going up, and governments are starting to increase interest rates to try to tame inflation. Cost of living is going off the roof. People are starting to feel the pinch. What does the federal government do? It calls on provinces and said, we all need to have rent controls, because we understand that for a considerable part of the population, rent is the number one expenditure. And we understand that this is going to be the part of the population that's going to be more directly affected by this. So if we pose rent controls right now, we're going to be protecting this share of the population, and we're also going to be able to tame inflation all around across the border, coupled with also the interest rates and other monetary policy, right? Guess what? It worked. In 1981, 1982, when you see inflation peaking, rent inflation, it's much lower than your headline inflation figure, right? What happened now? 2023, 2022, same context, no conversation about rent controls whatsoever. Then you look at the beginning of the year, the rent inflation is twice, in some months 3 times higher than what inflation head figure is. So back then, rent controls helped to pull inflation down. Right now, we allowed rents to pull inflation up, right? And what's the key and the only factor that was different here? Government willingness to step in and to tell landlords there's a cap here of how much profit you're going to be able to make. That political courage that was available back then was nowhere to be seen right now. So that's on the political front. On the policy debate front, it's also really hard to talk about rent control. And I know, because I talk about rent control all the time, and I get bullied out of the rooms because there is this mantra or this statement that says, this claim, that's a better way of describing it. There's a claim that rent controls kill supply. And that logic behind there is that if you put rent controls, there's going to be less incentives to build, there's going to be less supplies down the pipeline. So, and this is the absurdity of the statement, rent controls will actually hurt tenants, which you have to be really deep into some sort of neoliberal dream world to listen to that statement and not think that is nonsensical. So the problem with this argument is that quite deliberately sometimes the people making the argument confuse rent freezes that were implemented during wars and recessions and really difficult economic times where there was no investment whatsoever in housing. There was no government acting on it. The rent freezes came and they were arbitrary. People didn't know how long they were going to last or if they're going to, stay in place forever. And when you look at the research, on those types of rent freezes, or those types of measures, yes, they had a negative impact on quality and on ultimately on supply as well. Problem is, no one is talking about those rent controls. We're talking about rent controls that have rent increase guidelines, so rent increases can keep up to inflation, for example. We're talking about designing rent controls that are smart in that they allow perhaps for above guideline rent increases, or that they trigger a government intervention to help to keep old buildings up to good state of repair, and could be various combinations of policies and programs there. We're talking about much more sophisticated policies that would have an immediate impact on increasing affordability, and that would not have that impact. There's a lot of research on this already showing that. Actually, there's a 2020 CMHC study. The CMHC, Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Canadian Housing Agency Authority, looked at almost 50 years of data from mid 1970s, when right before we kicked in those rent controls that I referred to a while ago, and all the way to late 2010s, and they concluded like it has not had a negative impact on starts. If you compare, it's a perfect kind of like research design, because some provinces have and some provinces don't have, so you get to compare them, and the starts were not lower in provinces that had rent controls. Then you have to take into account, if you were trying to have a actually intelligent conversation about this, the fact that we have a bunch of incentives right now for building, and you have other problems like interest rates. So I'm going on and on with this, but I think that we need that nuanced and well-meant conversation about rent controls. We have a number of provinces right now that have no rent controls. New Brunswick's rent controls are among the weakest in the country. BC, Ontario, Quebec, PEI, Manitoba do a little bit better, but they have a lot of loopholes in all of these provinces as well, especially on the vacant units. So this is the last thing I'm going to say. In Canada, according to the latest data, the average rent increase on a vacant unit is 25%. So a tenant leaves, the next tenant comes in. In between, in that turnover, landlords increase rents by 25% on average across Canada. In Toronto, it's 40%. In Halifax, 23%. In Vancouver, it's 34%. There is a natural turnover of rental units, right? Anything between 10 and 20%. Depends what city you're looking at, what year you're looking at. But just think about it. Just the impact of vacancy controls could have on taming the rent, skyrocketing rents. 10 to 20% of all units are flipping every year, and the average rent increase is between 25 and 40%. If you impose a rent cap on vacant units, you would immediately start reversing the trend that Leanne and I and my colleague David McDonald have documented. The only reason we don't is because the real estate industry loves threatening actually, that rent controls are going to decrease supply, and the politicians in the various provinces and here in Ottawa do not have the courage to stand up against profit. That's kind of the bottom line for me.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, and makes total sense. Liam, what about you? You mentioned new government, some new hope. What are your hopes? What do you think has to change in New Brunswick?
Yeah, I think a lot of the comments that have just been made are quite relevant to New Brunswick. In a press release, to my recollection, the new government has promised a 3% rent cap. And there's been some rebuttal against that, even by the government that was previously in power, saying that, we've seen it in the past. That's just going to cause a larger turnover of tenants and those sorts of things. And while there may be some truth to that statement, the New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants' Rights, in partnership with both the University of Brunswick and St. Thomas University, published a report recently called Without Protection, an Examination of New Brunswick Rental Housing Crisis. And at the end of it, they propose a suite of rent control policies that they propose will help to fix this problem that we're currently seeing in New Brunswick. And they also do agree with the fact that a non-nuanced rent controls in New Brunswick are not going to be the solution. So here's a quote from that report. Predictable, universally applied rent increases and an application process for landlords who feel the need to exceed these increases is not part of the legislative plans for New Brunswick. So some of their recommendations are as follows. Apply a rent cap at the Consumer Price Index. Have an application process for above inflation increases and apply the rent cap to occupied and vacant units. So yeah, some legislative changes have been promised, and I think it's up to time to see whether or not we're going to see some progress here in New Brunswick. So yeah, it'd be nice to see rents stabilize, vacancy rates increase, turnover decrease. All the indicators that I think across the country we're all collectively interested in seeing improve.
Very cool. All right, guys. So listen, you did this work. It was a lot of work. It's important work. And the hope is that you could get it in the hands of decision makers, policy makers, people, or kind of rile up people to change. Ricardo and Liam, where can people find this, or where can people access the reports?
For us, you can just go online and type out of control rents, rental wage in Canada 2023, or just put rental wages 2023, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA. It's pretty easy to find. The only thing I would say is make sure you're reading the 2023 report, which is the latest one, which looks at the most recent data. We have like 2 other reports out there. Sometimes folks get into kind of jump on the wrong link. There's another report that I would like to promote, which is called the Rent Controls in Ontario, Facts, Flaws, and Fixes, where it looks at the situation in Ontario specifically, but has some sections there that deal with this sort of what I call in the report, myself and my colleague Paulina call in the report, this kind of like the misinformation machine or the propaganda against rent controls. The report kind of like looks at what are the major claims that we come across and what the research actually says, and then it provides some language, some direct stats for folks who are willing and interested to take on the rent control conversation. So rent wages in Canada 2023 and rent controls in Ontario, facts, flaws, and fixes.
Very cool. Thank you for that. And Liam, is the work that you've done in New Brunswick, is that public? Can people access it?
Yep. So our website is just sjdc.ca. And then we have a tab on our website called Research and Reports, and everything we've published for the last number of years will just appear there. The rental wages in New Brunswick 2023, it's a pretty recent report, so you'll be able to find that very easily. Also, our poverty reports in general, living wages, energy poverty, a whole bunch of other research is available there. So I'd encourage anybody wanting to learn about New Brunswick data on social issues, just go to sjdc.ca, Research and Reports, and you'll find it there.
That's my go-to for New Brunswick everything. That's my main and perhaps only source.
Very cool. Well, thank you both for the work you do, for taking the time out to share with us. Liam, I'm glad you didn't stay in the U.S. We're glad you're back in Canada doing the important work you're doing. And Ricardo, like I said, anytime either of you have, we're so grateful, because often when we want change, people ask, show me the data, right? You guys are doing that. Here's the data and more. Here's some solutions moving forward. Thank you for doing this work, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you both soon.